In the shadow of smoke-choked battlefields, the air thick with gunpowder and fear. Rivers ran red with the blood of brothers, and yet the world, it mostly turned away. Blind, silent. Watching the agony of America unfold like a tragedy written in fire and iron. Welcome to Simple Historian. Today, we dive into the American Civil War, not the sanitized version you might see in textbooks, but the raw, unfiltered horror that reshaped warfare forever. This wasn't just North versus South. It was a brutal experiment, a grim laboratory for modern combat, claiming over 600,000 lives. Men were cut down not just by rifles and cannons, but by the cold efficiency of industrial-age logistics. Trains carried iron and men faster than ever. And factories churned out bullets and shells like a relentless heartbeat of destruction. And Europe? Europe sent its sharpest eyes to watch. Officers, aristocrats, spies in uniform, diplomats disguised as observers, all came to study the carnage without getting their hands dirty. Why? Because armies have been studying foreign wars for centuries. Lessons in strategy, tactics, and technology were priceless. And the American Civil War promised more than a lesson. It promised a glimpse at the future of warfare. Picture Europe in the 1860s, a continent teetering under crowns, empires bristling at one another, revolutions simmering just beneath the surface. The United States? A distant, chaotic upstart. To most Europeans, it was stories of immigrants, cotton exports, and unpredictable democracy. But when the Civil War erupted, it gripped Europe like a dark opera. Tragic, monstrous, hypnotic. Publicly, European governments declared support for the Union. Slavery was a barbaric stain, they claimed, and the North's cause noble. Privately, some aristocrats rooted for the South. They saw in the Confederate elite a familiar structure, genteel, traditional, resistant to the industrial and democratic upheaval spreading like wildfire. A Southern victory might crush reformist experiments in America, but it would also feel like a preservation of order for the old world. The timing, too, was remarkable. Only a few years earlier, the Crimean War and the Italian War of 1859 had shown how technology was reshaping combat. Rifled guns ripping through lines, railroads moving men and material at unprecedented speed. Yet those wars were incomplete tests. Not every nation had industrial teeth. The Union North, though, was a factory-fueled giant, a beast of iron, steam, and determination. Europeans watched, salivating. Could this reveal the true cost of industrial war? Could it show how a citizen army, volunteers motivated by ideology instead of tradition, would fare against sheer industrial might? Abraham Lincoln understood the stakes. He played the diplomat's game with finesse. Northern observers were welcomed, Southern observers tolerated under scrutiny. Deny access, and European outrage might fracture the blockade, or worse, draw intervention. So the eyes of Europe roamed freely, ghosts moving through battlefields, tents, and encampments, watching every maneuver, every victory, every horrifying slaughter. Not every nation cared equally, though. The newly unified Kingdom of Italy, barely born weeks before the first shots at Fort Sumter, was tangled in its own struggles, swallowing Naples, negotiating with the Pope, trying to forge an identity. For them, America's blood-soaked fields were distant noise. Austria? Their reports arrived like whispers drowned in a storm. Vienna hardly looked west. Their army, still reeling from defeat in 1859, clung to outdated methods and aristocratic rigidity. Early observer dispatches noted rifles, artillery, and fortifications, the basics of war, but the later reports screamed warnings. Your army is obsolete. Modern industrial war is here. Austria shrugged, seeing America as a distant sideshow. Defeat in 1866 would finally shake them awake, but only after tragedy had already forced the lesson. And the Ottoman Empire? Yes, even they sent formal observers. Reports were filed meticulously, yet after the ink dried, the pages sat forgotten in the Sublime Porte's dusty archives. Fresh from the humiliation of the Crimean War, they'd modernized haltingly. And the American Civil War's lessons on industrialized conflict simply weren't a priority. Russia, though, played a more subtle game. Officially, the Tsar seemed disinterested. The Crimean War had gutted the Russian Empire's pride. Alexander II poured blood and treasure into reforms, emancipating serfs, reorganizing armies, modernizing weapons. Official dispatches noted the war from a distance. But behind the curtain, eyes were wide open. September 1863, Russian squadrons silently slipped into New York and San Francisco. On the surface, a show of solidarity with the Union. Parades, dances, even visits from Mary Lincoln herself. A spectacle of friendship. But beneath the pomp lay calculation. Poland's January uprising still smoldered, and Britain and France's fleets loomed as potential threats. The Russian Navy positioned itself in neutral American ports, ready for action if necessary, while quietly gathering intelligence. The ships themselves, frigates like Alexander Nevsky, corvettes, and auxiliary vessels, endured weeks at sea, battling scurvy, spoiled food, treacherous navigation. In New York, the Russian officers grilled locals on the Union Navy's readiness, blockade tactics, and the revolutionary ironclads like the USS Monitor. They wanted details: turret designs, naval strategies, industrial capacity. Later, Russian arsenals would adopt American breech-loading rifles and experiment with cavalry tactics inspired by Union raiders. And the Pacific Squadron? Drama unfolded off the Californian coast. Ships arrived amid fires and earthquakes. One vessel, the Novik, wrecked on Point Reyes' fog-shrouded rocks, yet the crew survived. Admiral Popov kept a neutral face. But Americans whispered hopes that Russian guns might strike Confederate raiders. The intelligence gathered exposed Russia's own weaknesses: readiness, health crisis, logistics, but it also ignited a hunger for modernization. Meanwhile, back in Europe, observers recorded every detail. Scheibert in the Confederate ranks, Austrian officers noting artillery tactics, Ottoman scribes filing reports, all feeding knowledge into bureaucracies that largely ignored it. Europe, in general, dismissed the American bloodbath as amateurish. Industrialized, citizen-led armies? Too chaotic. Volunteer-driven innovation? Too democratic. Yet beneath that arrogance, the future of warfare was quietly unfolding, piece by bloody piece. Not all eyes in Europe dismissed the lessons of America. Some powers leaned closer, curiosity sharpening into obsession. Prussia and France, military titans locked in a deadly silent dance, sent their best to observe. They understood that industrialized warfare was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time across the American landscape. Helmuth von Malta, Prussia's famed chief of staff, did not sneer at the war as armed mobs. Contrary to legend, he feared complacency. Napoleon's shadow haunted him, and he sought to prepare for the next conflict in Europe. Official missions were dispatched, and junior officers were encouraged to volunteer in the field, embedding themselves within Union and Confederate units alike. They rode through forests, crossed rivers, and mapped battles with meticulous detail. Every logistical success, every catastrophic failure, was noted. France mirrored this approach. Officers joined McClellan's Peninsula Campaign in 1862, studying the mud, the chaos, the triumphs and failures. By 1864, a logistics-focused team followed the Army of the Potomac, noting supply lines, artillery effectiveness, and troop morale, all while Mexico's ongoing conflicts tugged at French attention. Across both nations, the verdict was consistent. America's war was a freak show, wildly inapplicable to the carefully measured, disciplined battlefields of Europe. Yet even amid skepticism, admiration shone through. Captain Justus Scheibert, Prussia's quasi-official observer with the Confederacy, wrote with awe of Robert E. Lee and Southern officers. Disciplined, daring, almost mythic figures. But Scheibert also recognized the industrial might of the North. He admitted that Southern hope was doomed without factories, railroads, and naval coordination. French observers agreed. American artillery crews were astonishingly efficient, soldiers resilient to the point of grim endurance. But despite admiration, the differences were damning. Europe relied on standing armies, professional officers, and rigid hierarchies. America fought with volunteers learning in blood, improvising tactics, dragging the war into a 4-year abyss. Scheibert blamed amateur officers for indecision and chaos, while French observers noted the vast distances and rugged terrain that distorted European notions of battle. Lombardy's 350,000 troops crammed into a small area? That was standard. New Hampshire? Union forces were spread over 1,500 kilometers. Independent, dispersed, impossible to strike decisively. Tactics collided. In Europe, massed artillery barrages. Coordinated infantry advances, cavalry charges to break lines. In America, Dense forests, hills, and rivers turned artillery blind. Infantry slugfests dragged on for hours. Cavalry was often wasted on broken, impassable terrain. Observers like heroes von Bork and Otto Hüsinger documented these clashes of doctrine. Rifled muskets, entrenched positions, and improvised raiding units signaled a new, brutal era of warfare. Yet Europe's biases, Prussian pride, Confederate sympathy blinded them to the total war America was practicing. Britain, with its empire and Canadian interests, watched anxiously. Official missions analyzed Union industrial capacity, forts, and weaponry, while journalists and traveling officers flooded the camps. Public opinion leaned pro-Union, aristocracy often pro-South. Bestsellers like L.T. Call Arthur Fremantle's 3 Months in the Southern States painted romantic portraits of Confederate gallantry. Yet beneath the surface, military professionals noted efficiency, logistics, and improvisation that challenged conventional wisdom. And then there was Henry Fletcher, a Scottish observer embedded with Union forces. He didn't romanticize the conflict. He saw messy, undisciplined armies adapting instinctively to new dangers, egalitarian, bottom-up innovation at work in real time. Fletcher warned that Europe's aristocratic, rigid systems would crumble under modern total war unless reforms were made. His work would inspire institutions like the Royal Military College of Canada and influence generations of military thinkers. By the war's end, Europe had gathered intelligence, admiration, and warnings, yet few were heeded. Prussia's rapid wars, Britain's cautious reforms, France's defeats, all would eventually show that ignoring America's blood-soaked lessons came at a cost. And yet, the notebooks, dispatches, and observations remained. They waited quietly on desks and archives, whispering a warning the world would finally hear decades later, in the mud and steel of 1914. Europe's eyes didn't close entirely. Prussia, France, and Britain had gathered notebooks, sketches, and first-hand observations, a treasure trove of knowledge about industrialized warfare. But admiration and caution often collided with arrogance. They studied, they wrote, they whispered, yet most dismissed the lessons as quirks of a foreign land. America's forests, rivers, and endless volunteer armies were alien. Europe's generals wanted battles neat, decisive, predictable. America offered chaos, endurance, and improvisation. Let's begin with Prussia. Justus Scheibert's detailed reports from Confederate ranks weren't just fan letters to Lee. They were careful studies of morale, supply, and battlefield dynamics. He noted how smaller units, operating semi-independently, could exploit terrain to disrupt far larger forces. European officers, conditioned to drill and hierarchy, found it fascinating but nearly unthinkable. The lessons were clear: decentralized command, initiative from the ranks, industrial support, all critical for modern war. France, too, sent officers deep into the conflict. Staff officers joined campaigns like McClellan's Peninsula Advance, mapping supply lines, studying artillery deployment, and watching infantry adapt to terrain and firepower. Mexico's ongoing unrest pulled French attention elsewhere, but they still absorbed what they could. Their conclusion? America's war was exceptional, almost absurd, too chaotic to replicate in Europe's manicured fields. Yet they also recorded remarkable efficiency, endurance, and innovation in both armies. And Britain, cautious, global, and deeply aware of Canadian proximity, observed differently. 2 wars with America already haunted them. Official missions focused on logistics, forts, weaponry. Journalists documented everything from camp life to battles. Aristocrats cheered the South. The public cheered the Union. Books like L.T. Call. Arthur Fremantle's 3 Months in the Southern States painted the conflict with romantic flair. Yet beneath it, military men noted things textbooks could not convey: adaptability, initiative, and sheer resilience in a citizen army. Henry Fletcher, a Scottish officer, saw beyond romance and chaos. Embedded with Union forces, he noted sloppy formations, undisciplined troops, and improvisation on the fly. But he also saw brilliance: looser formations surviving against deadlier rifles, cover and entrenchments instinctively employed, junior officers learning rapidly from experience. Fletcher warned that Europe's aristocratic systems would struggle in a total war scenario. His recommendations: universal training, better education, and organizational reform influenced the Royal Military College of Canada and, indirectly, British staff thinking. Yet, despite all these insights, Europe's elites largely ignored them. Prussia would go on to crush Denmark, Austria, and France in rapid wars, confirming the effectiveness of railroads, mobilization, and concentrated firepower, not the drawn-out, improvised, total war of the American Civil War. Britain reformed cautiously, France stumbled disastrously. The American grind, citizen armies, industrial logistics, deadly attrition, was written off as an exotic quirk, not a blueprint for the next century of conflict. And so the warnings sat quietly in archives, waiting decades for a world ready to pay attention. When 1914 erupted, Europe's generals discovered what the notebooks, sketches, and observations had long foretold. Total war was coming. It would be bloody, unrelenting, and it would echo the forests, hills, and fields of America half a century before. But admiration and observation weren't enough. Bias crept in like smoke over a battlefield, distorting lessons before they could be learned. Scheibert's hero worship of Lee and Southern officers painted the Confederacy as noble and doomed only because of industrial imbalance. Prussian pride filtered every insight. Yes, America's volunteers improvised brilliantly, but Europe's professional armies were better by default. France saw efficiency, endurance, and ingenuity, yet labeled it exotic, a freak show, irrelevant to European conflicts. Britain too struggled. Journalists romanticized Confederate bravery, aristocrats backed Southern interests, and even professional officers often let prejudice cloud judgment. They admired the grit, the logistics, the improvisation, but rarely internalized the deeper lesson. Total war requires flexibility, initiative, and the ability to harness an industrial base. Europe's generals read the pages, but didn't see the future. This dismissal had consequences. By the time Prussia mobilized against Austria in 1866, or France faced defeat in 1870–71, European powers were still relying on rigid doctrines, concentrated formations, and predictable tactics. The American Civil War had revealed a model of dispersed operations, initiative-driven units, and industrialized logistics, the very elements that would define modern warfare in the 20th century. Yet these lessons were largely ignored. The human cost of this oversight would echo decades later. Observers documented the horrors of Gettysburg, Antietam, and Petersburg, mass casualties, entrenched positions, and the terrifying effectiveness of rifled weapons. Yet these warnings were buried beneath pride, tradition, and the comforting assumption that European armies were somehow immune to such grinding attrition. Germany's rapid wars and Britain's cautious reforms offered superficial reassurance, masking the deeper, systemic lessons left unlearned. Meanwhile, Russia quietly absorbed the innovations it could. Breech-loading rifles, ironclad-inspired turret designs, and cavalry tactics adapted from Union raiders all made their way into arsenals and exercises. The Pacific Squadron's mishaps in San Francisco, from wrecked corvettes to logistical struggles, revealed weaknesses that spurred reform. But even here, adaptation was piecemeal, a partial acknowledgement of America's industrialized war, not a full embrace. The irony is stark. Europe had watched total war unfold: citizen armies, massive industrial output, decentralized command, attritional campaigns, and yet the lessons were smothered by tradition and pride. The world's first industrialized civil war had served as both a warning and a blueprint. Only decades later would generals, theorists, and planners finally grasp what Europe had glimpsed but dismissed. The next great conflicts would demand adaptation, flexibility, and acceptance of staggering human cost. And so the notebooks, letters, and reports gathered dust. They whispered warnings in empty offices, waiting for a generation bold enough, or desperate enough, to finally listen. When 1914 arrived, Europe's fields became America's nightmare reborn. The forests and hills, the rivers and valleys, the entrenched lines and relentless slaughter, all echoed the lessons ignored 50 years earlier. But the story doesn't end there. Understanding these missed warnings illuminates how nations prepare, adapt, and sometimes fail catastrophically. It is a tale of arrogance, obsession, and human resilience, a story that continues to teach those willing to listen. By the late 19th century, the echoes of the American Civil War lingered quietly in Europe's archives, in officer notebooks, and in the memories of those who had witnessed it firsthand. Prussia, France, Britain, and Russia all carried fragments of knowledge, sometimes revered, sometimes dismissed, like ghosts of lessons unlearned. Yet the world moved forward, confident in its doctrines, unprepared for the storm that loomed on the horizon. The Prussian victories over Denmark, Austria, and finally France in 1870–71 seemed to validate their rigid, professional approach. Massed formations, concentrated firepower, disciplined conscripts. These methods were efficient, fast, and decisive. Yet they also concealed the very weaknesses America had exposed decades earlier. The perils of over-reliance on hierarchy, the neglect of initiative at lower levels, and the failure to adapt to industrialized, total war. Observers like Scheibert and Heroes von Bork had written vivid accounts of decentralized command, volunteer endurance, and improvised tactics. Europe had glanced at these lessons, then turned away. Britain, still cautious, reformed slowly. Fletcher's warnings led to institutional changes like the Royal Military College of Canada and subtle doctrinal updates, but the emphasis remained on tradition, discipline, and controlled maneuvering. The egalitarian, adaptive, citizen-soldier approach of the Union Army was admired but never fully adopted. Europe preferred comfort and predictability, until 1914 forced it into chaos. Russia, quietly ambitious, absorbed what it could. Breech-loading rifles, turret-inspired ironclads, cavalry raiding concepts, all filtered into Russian practice. Yet even this modernization was piecemeal, reactive, and limited by bureaucracy and resource constraints. The American lessons were glimpsed, but never fully embraced, leaving gaps that would influence decades of military thought. The human toll of ignoring these lessons became painfully clear in World War I. The forests of France and Belgium, the trenches of the Somme and Verdun, the relentless grinding of men into mud and steel. It was America's nightmare reborn. European generals who had studied the American Civil War saw its warnings too late. The volunteer armies, industrialized slaughter, and decentralized initiative America had perfected in 1861–65 were now Europe's grim reality. And yet, amid the horror, there was understanding. Historians and theorists in the 1930s, like Basil Littlehart and J.F.C. Fuller, analyzed these oversights. They argued that Britain, Germany, France, and others had glimpsed the future in America, but dismissed it, blinded by pride, bias, and short-term success. The notebooks, letters, and first-hand reports that once gathered dust now screamed their warnings across decades and continents. History, then, is not just a record of battles won or lost. It is a story of observation, understanding, and often tragically, of lessons ignored. The European observers of the American Civil War offer a haunting reminder. Seeing is not the same as learning, and knowledge unused can be a kind of betrayal. So when we look back beyond the blood, the smoke, and the mud, we see the intricate web of human ambition, pride, and error. The Civil War shaped more than a nation. It shaped the minds of observers who carried its echoes into future conflicts, for better or worse. And if we listen closely, we can still hear the whispers from those archives, calling us to remember, to understand, and to never ignore the warnings history places before us. Join us at Simple Historian as we continue to uncover these shadows of the past. Subscribe, like, comment, and become part of the journey. The stories are waiting, the lessons are there, and the human truths behind history are more alive than ever.